Jerome, you've been here for 4 years, a very dramatic time, and I'd like to give the general overview. Was really Ukraine at some point, when we are speaking about it, dealing with IMF, on the edge of default, on the edge of bankruptcy? Now it's just kind of a steady cooperation. So can you just very generally say what was the state of affairs, what risks were, and at what conditions are we now?
I would say the first thing is that, in 2013 there were already large imbalances in the economy, and it was not a sustainable situation. You had a very large current account deficit, a large fiscal deficit, no growth, reserves which were being exhausted, and an unsustainable exchange rate. So that was the starting point. But of course, with all the shocks that Ukraine has been going through, it has made the situation extremely difficult, and starting very quickly in the spring of 2014. And so Ukraine has faced a very unique situation with strong external shocks, with a conflict ongoing, with trade shocks, and with the adjustment which was needed in any case to adjust from those large imbalances which were pre-existing. So it's a unique combination of factors, and certainly for the IMF it has been a unique situation to deal with.
What do you remember? Because what people understand what is a dramatic moment when you speak about the war or the Maidan. But the question, rather than when there is this big deal or a loan or this talk about reconstruction of the loan, nobody sees it as something, and then later you hear that, we were on the edge of not getting that, if the country's economy would collapse. So would you remember, what were these what would be particularly for you, the most critical cases for for IMF, for your cooperation, for the whole thing the IMF is doing?
Some of the first meetings I had in February 24th of 2014, for example. So these moments were pretty decisive, and I think the international community reacted very, very quickly at the time, with of course a lot of commitment from the authorities at the time to show that they were ready to take reforms, and that was something which we forget now, but which was very important for the international community, because the experience previously with Ukraine had been of a lack of commitment to undertake reforms, and a number of failed attempts. So that those moments, and those very first months, especially in 2014, were critical.
So Ukraine over this time had received almost $9 billion of the US dollars. We had the loans, we had the restructurization of the national debt. That looks good so far, but we know that there are that Ukraine has to give the loans back. So, and especially there would be 2018, 2019. So really, would Ukraine be able to really give those money back, or that we would have another talk about restructurization of the debt and also again postponing? So that would be still the loan which you have rather than solution.
I think when we put in place an IMF program and IMF support, which we reassess periodically for each review, every time we look at of course at the capacity of the country to repay. We do not want to overburden the country. That debt restructuring has allowed to gain some breathing space for some time. But indeed, that means also that the repayments will start to increase after some point. All this, in fact, should be, I think, an additional motivation for the authorities to understand that they need to continue to accumulate reserves, that they need to be very careful on the developments on the current account and the deficit. But more importantly, that they need to make the connection between the need for structural reforms and the external situation. Basically, that means that Ukraine at the moment is still not attracting enough foreign direct investment. It is not attracting enough privatization related revenues, which could also help for foreign exchange reserves. So that still has that linkage still has to be made.
Is it really happening? I mean, today we can already assess the way the government is working, and there is the flow of the reforms. So what you say is that, you know, there are conditions for the loans. And we are speaking about how to get out of this vicious circle of country getting more and more loans rather than being able to pay them. So at this point, you mentioned some of the critical things with privatization, but really, do you see there is enough done in order to work according to the plan?
I think we have seen a lot of changes, but as we have underlined on a few occasions, and I would certainly leave this as a message, there is really a need to accelerate reforms and what we call structural reforms, which in the case of Ukraine are very focused on the need to improve the business environment, to improve the situation with respect to corruption. That takes many forms, including, for example, reforming the state-owned enterprises, which it's not only a fiscal issue, but it's also an issue of governance.
So according to different kinds of research, up to 40% of the Ukrainian economy is a shadow economy. So really how to get out of this situation, how we can get the situation where there is such a chunk, such a part of our economy with no taxes being paid to the budget, what really could be done?
Well, I mean, it's one of the most difficult challenges and that we see not only in Ukraine but in many other countries, including in the euro area, for example. But clearly, you know, the estimates differ on the size of the shadow economy, but it's clearly fairly large in Ukraine. And it is clearly a problem because that means that the burden of the adjustment, for example, from a fiscal perspective, falls on those who are paying taxes and honestly paying taxes. That some of the impunity that we see in the business environment is removed. It is still a system where you have a number of large groups which are involved in different sectors of the economy, where vested interests are very powerful in the political system. At the same time, we do not see a large role for small and medium-sized enterprises, and that is one of the things that will need to change going forward, and in particular to make growth much more sustainable. It's a pity because we see a lot of potential in Ukraine. There are many sectors where we see a lot of potential for development. We all know that in Ukraine there's tremendous potential in IT, in a few other sectors. That's typically the sectors where we can see development of small and medium-sized businesses, and quite dynamic ones. And these are also industries which are less regulated or less prone to vested interests. So that's where there is an avenue, in fact, to expand the size of the economy. But it's also important, of course, to make sure that the conditions for competition proper competition are met in the economy. That means probably addressing in the future issues related to the way that competition is monitored in the economy. Looking at the role of state-owned enterprises, because very often there is a large influence of vested interest in those enterprises. So there's a number of things which still need to be done.
So what is your personal encounter, maybe a personal communication during this week with these people like Rinat Akhmetov or Igor Kolomoisky, whom you can't ignore if you speak about the Ukrainian reform and Ukrainian economy? So what would be your impression? You know, what communication you maybe were supposed to have in any case, and how do you see also their role in the future of the Ukrainian economy, and they wouldn't disappear?
We, as an institution, we are not dealing with individuals or individual companies specifically. So I do not. My main task is to discuss with the authorities and to discuss the policies. But that's the way I approach it. I do not. We do not assign a more important role to different people, and we do not deal specifically with individual institutions. So we discuss the policies with the authorities that who are our main interlocutors and who are in charge of implementing the commitment that they take with the international community.
But in the end, how you may deal, because a lot from what are IMF requirements, it's about how the state deals with oligarchs, and their opinion matter. If you speak about the huge changes, so really, and in the different institutions, obviously the international partners, they are supposed, to speak to those who matters, not just to the authorities. So really, how do you rather see that, what could be done with that? Because they would remain, and they still are the owners of the Mr. Akhmetov, Mr. Kolomoisky, and the others, of the owners of the large, just industries. And without their will and without the way they deal, we can't go with privatization. There is the issue with the bank reform and everything which happened. So how you see that would be, what would be really their role?
We do not see that there are some individuals which should be treated above the law. The law should apply to everybody, and a good part of the policy that we support is also to end some of the impunity that we have seen for way too long in Ukraine. But it's also important to see that there are a number of policies where actually which are not labeled as anti-corruption, but which have an important impact. In particular, as maybe you alluded to, for example, in the financial sector, where a lot of the effort has been made by the central bank to ask when there are vulnerabilities which are detected. To ask the bank owners to put capital in the bank. If they do not manage to put capital in the bank, then a solution has to be found for these institutions. Similarly, there was a big effort done to address issues of what we call related party lending, meaning that a lot of the banks were actually used by their owners to finance their own activities in breach of Ukrainian prudential regulation, but any kind of international best practice. And that's also a way of course, to protect the depositors themselves. And it's no surprise that we see also very often some resistance from vested interest, and in particular through the political system to those policies.
So Valeria, if we started to speak about the National Bank, of course, Valeria Gontareva has resigned. There should be still her resignation had to be admitted. But if we're already speaking about a new person, what kind of tasks you are expecting from the new head of the National Bank? What would be that he or she must have to do?
I think it's important to see first that Mrs. Gontareva, as governor of the National Bank of Ukraine during those years, has done a tremendous job in doing what has not been done for way too many years, meaning properly supervising and cleaning up the banking sector. But also reforming the central bank as an institution. It is now a modern central bank with which we can have an informed dialogue. It is really a revamped and new central bank. So that's an important legacy which has to continue, and it's important that all those gains are not reversed. That will be fundamental going forward. A lot of the heavy lifting has been done on cleaning up the banking sector. There's still some way to go. And there is an ongoing process of recapitalization and also addressing related party lending in the system and properly supervising the banks. That has to continue. And then there are a number of course, new issues that also rise. I mean, some of them are not completely new, but take a new dimension. For example, there will be an important effort together with the government and the Ministry of Finance to have a proper strategy for state-owned banks, for ensuring a proper governance of state-owned banks. So that's one of the challenges that is still ahead. Another challenge which is still ahead, but is more now within the remit of the government as a shareholder, is also to recover as much as possible from the loans in some of these institutions.
But we see a bit of the difference in the way, because the IMF and a number of the international partners, they really take credit for the work that Ms. Gontareva has done, but she is pretty not popular figure in the Ukrainian society, in the in some kind of political environment. There is a lot of criticism of her on her different businesses, on particular cases with like the bank Hromadske, or with the maybe not clear things with the trading the inner information, all kind of things. And it's pretty present in the Ukrainian public discourse. So there is this kind of the support from the international community and a huge criticism from some of the, part of the society or political groups. How would you explain that? That kind of such a good job is considered, has so many critics.
I think, it's like in other episodes of economic history, it will take some time before people fully realize what has been done and how important it was. So it's entirely natural that what most people see is a negative aspect of it. And there were some of these what I would call some economic illusions, for example, on the exchange rate or on the health of the banking system, which were maintained for way too long. So that, of course, is a very harsh adjustment. The other one is, of course, the fact that there are a lot of vested interests. There are a lot of bank owners, including in Parliament, which, of course, we're not happy with some of the policies which were, in fact, rightly put in place. In particular, those that I mentioned, properly capitalizing the banks, making sure that the banks are not lending to their owners, making sure that they are implementing the right policies, for example, on anti-money laundering and a lot of things. So, of course, there were a number of unhappy people.
So can you tell the story of the nationalization of the private bank? As this is a really important issue of the last year, what was the role of the IMF and international community?
First of all, the story is not over because in many ways it is an ongoing process, and we shouldn't forget that. You know, it took several years. First of all, to understand the extent of the problem, like for many other banks also, which were weak and improperly managed in the system. That was the first step, and which was not an easy step. Then once a clear diagnostic was made, and there we, you know, the national bank as a supervisor had also the support from the technical support from the international community. Once that diagnostic was made, you know, there are the usual policies that the owners are asked to recapitalize. And in the end, if they are not able to do so, then a solution has to be found for the institution to maintain the stability in the system. Of course, a lot of the I think a lot of the concern at the time was to make sure that whatever solution was implemented for the bank would not affect financial stability, because the bank was essentially what we call systemic, in the sense that it potentially could have an impact on the whole banking system, and in particular on the liquidity of the banking system, on the deposit base. So, you know, it has been a difficult operation for the authorities, but I think on preserving the stability of the financial system at the time when it was done, that has been pretty much achieved. Now there are a lot of challenges still ahead with the nationalization of that bank. Meaning in particular that there is still a strong need to make the utmost effort to recover as much as feasible from the loans which were not paid. That is, I believe, not only important from a fiscal perspective, because of course there is significant fiscal cost, but that is also important for governance, and to make sure that we do not see similar issues in the future, and that there is again a proper recovery of the funds which were misallocated.
You mentioned that the story isn't over. You just elaborated a bit on that, but still, what would be the one biggest issue regarding the private bank at the moment?
At the moment, it's very simple and very complicated at the same time. But it's basically to recover the loans which are due to the bank, which most of them, as you know, were granted to related parties, basically shareholders and related parties. So that is the main task at the moment. The task of stabilizing the liability side, which is basically the deposit side, has been achieved, but there is an important component which is also in the commitments that Ukraine has taken with the IMF in particular, to recover as much as feasible.
How much is that burden for the Ukrainian economy?
Well, we'll have to assess what will be the final cost. The recoveries in those cases take some time. For the time being, as you know, the cost is in excess of 5% of GDP, but we hope that as much effort will be done to lower that amount. So there is the final answer basically on the total cost will be only known when that process of recovery will be achieved, and sometimes it can take a while.
Still, we remember, I think, very well those night in evening when it was Sunday evening, the largest bank in the country. In the morning, you still don't know it would happen. There is very little news about that, and like late night we know, and in the morning everything is done. So of course we understand that, you know, with nationalizing the bank, you would like, you know, not to have the panic of the population, but still there is a bit of the, you know, as for the public, too much of the candid and hidden information about the process had been done. So were there really a lot of, as we ensured, a lot of behind the doors and undercovered, you know, communication with the owners of the bank? You know, what we can know about that, you know, how many parties had been involved into, you know, dealing with that, maybe some other international partners or, you know, some other people from the government, because it was not definitely just the case between the, you know, national bank and the Mr. Kolomoisky himself.
Well, I mean, in all of these cases of bank recapitalization, essentially, the process is mostly between the supervisor and the bank owners. So, and we see that in all the countries. In those cases, it's of course it has some confidential aspects, and in particular because there is some information which can be market sensitive or which can have an impact on the stability of the system. So it is, you know, not only the case in Ukraine, but in many other cases in other countries that a lot of these discussions take place between the supervisor and the bank owner. But I think the central bank has, and the Ukrainian authorities through the Ministry of Finance have been pretty straightforward in also communicating on the motivations for the nationalization, and actually very quite early on. And the problem was known for some time. And there was an indication already that these things were actively looked at. And once the nationalization was done, I think there was a fair amount of explanation provided of more detailed numbers, and we will see, of course, more of that as we go along.
But were you really, I mean, over general, if we're speaking about that, it was never smooth cooperation. It's not always that smooth. It doesn't. So, where are the things which are really annoying for you, and which had annoyed you during this time?
There are certainly a number of areas where I think things could have gone quicker, and where, you know, the dialogue has been perhaps a bit more difficult or more slow at times, and where I think a lot more needs to be done on the anti-corruption front, and if I would like to see much quicker progress, and I think we could have achieved quicker progress is on that front. And it covers a number of areas, including on things like state-owned enterprises, privatization, for example, where the progress has been very, very slow. So that's a kind of sometimes dialogue which can be more difficult, because it's also, of course, sometimes politically difficult. It's a system which has its own parts of inertia, own pockets of inertia, and where it takes basically a strong will and determination to change things.
But I would really clarify, because today we speak a lot for the couple of years about anti-corruption. But what do you mean by corruption? as a representative of IMF. I understand what we mean by corruption. No, if you're, you need to go to the school and you pay a bribe to a kid, if you need to get to the hospital, you pay a bribe, and all that kind of things. We investigated a lot of things, but when you speak about fighting corruption in Ukraine, what do you mean in particular if you would like to see the things which are improved?
We cannot address all those issues, and we know that very, very well. So we have tended to focus on high-level corruption, because we also think that a lot of the change has to come from the top, and in particular from the use of public funds.
So what are your major concerns? If you speak about the corruption, we mentioned especially privatization. So what are in particular IMF the major concerns if you speak about the corruption in times where you need to have long-lasting structural reforms?
I think where we see, I'll start with some of the progress that we see. Okay? I think some of the progress that we have seen is that there is much more talk about corruption, and much more specific talk about corruption, not only in broad terms, but on very specific matters. That is a good thing, because shedding light on corruption is the first way to tackle it, essentially. Corruption doesn't like light too much. But it has the flip side of that, is that also it raises a lot of expectations from the population, and sometimes also the perception that maybe things have not changed, or they are even worse than before. So it's also a double-edged sword, and the only way to address that is to make sure that that the Ukrainian authorities also address this issue of impunity, and for that, now I think we have a better detection, investigation of some of the high-level corruption in particular. But what is missing is the basically the last step, which is also perhaps one of the most important, which is at the judicial level. And we still see a very significant gap. For example, there's been a lot of progress done with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, but what we see is that a lot of the cases basically die in court. So one of the options that has been supported by the international community together with civil society is, for example, the creation of an anti-corruption court, which would seek to address that big gap that we see. It is true in other areas as well. I mean, we have talked about the efforts of the National Bank to clean up the banking system, and what we see, unfortunately, is that some of these cases where the former owner should be sanctioned actually also dying in court, because there are a lot of issues with the court systems here. So that is major examples of things which need to be done. Well, what we have seen early on was an important step of macroeconomic stabilization, which has been very difficult, especially considering the circumstances that Ukraine was facing at the time. What we saw also was some positive developments in dealing with some of the taboos which have not been addressed for a long time, including on energy prices, on the exchange rate. But also reforming the financial, starting to do reform and clean up the banking sector. But we are now in a stage where some of the structural reforms need to be accelerated and deepened. And in many countries, it's actually one of the most difficult stages, because from some of these reforms are particularly difficult to implement. They're difficult to design, first of all, then to implement, and then very often they show their results with some time lag.
And is it the case when we see that there would be some postpone of the land reform on the way that the land would be, we would be able to sell it? That there won't be moratorium? To what extent this is an issue? And is it the case then the IMF sees that it wouldn't be done anytime soon?
Well, there are a number of important policy changes that have been undertaken as commitments by the Ukrainian authorities, and that is one of them. For us, it's something that we see as important, not only to end an abnormal situation where basically you have millions of landowners, but who are not really owning their land because they cannot really do what they want with their land. There is also a parallel situation with the state-owned land, which is very poorly managed. And quasi-privately managed in many ways. So we see that as in many ways, not only as because there is a need to end this abnormal situation, but also because we see that as a way also to boost growth over the medium term. So what is important is that the reform gets started quickly, and in a way which can make sure that it is successful, essentially.
To clarify, what we've heard that there is more or less the acceptance by the IMF that the land reform wouldn't take place very soon, that it could be postponed, and that's accepted.
Well, we are still in the process of what we call a review, which is basically a discussion of all the policy. I mean, there is a backward-looking aspect of it, of what has been done and achieved, and there is a forward-looking aspect, which is basically the policy commitments taken by the authorities in a number of areas, and that we could support. And that could be discussed at the board. There are several important policy discussions that have taken place, in particular on pension reform, on anti-corruption, privatization, on land reform, and all these are important aspects for us to be able to move forward with our support and to achieve what I've been mentioning before, that is this more sustainable growth. As a lender, of course, we want to see this economy grow. We want to see this economy modernized, and land reform is one important aspect of that.
We are speaking about the next tranche from next loan. As some of the investors says that there are issues with that, so what are the conditions to be fulfilled in order to get it? What is the probability of not getting it? And when we can expect that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing process of the review that would lead to the disbursement of that tranche after discussion at the IMF board. But we basically we need to have clarity on a number of issues, and of course the usual issues that are included in the IMF program and in all areas, including financial sector, fiscal, energy, and so on. But this time around, there is a number of policies where there is a bit more focus, and we discussed some of them, but that includes, for example, pension reform, anti-corruption policies, including the creation of an anti-corruption court, land reform and privatization. So these are areas where we, during this review and during this discussion, we will put much more focus. So it will be important for us in order to be able to move forward and to present a good case to the international community, that we have clarity on those different aspects and what the Ukrainian authorities are in a position to do and implement effectively. The answer is relatively easy, that takes as much time as is needed to find what we call first a staff level agreement on the policies, and that we can move forward to a discussion with at the board level.
A very simple question. Do you think Ukraine may survive today without IMF funds?
Well, I mean, our role is to comprises different aspects. We provide the financial support, which is what is most known. We provide also a lot of technical assistance and advice on the policies, which can take place with or without funding. And in many countries we do that as well. What we hope to see is that Ukraine can stand on its feet in the future, and more importantly can achieve sustainable growth. We will always be here as a land of last resort for all of our member countries. That is our role. But what I think what is critical now is that Ukraine achieves some of this sustainable growth that needs to be achieved. There is still a need to build up reserves and basically the protection for Ukraine against economic shocks. So there is still some progress on the external front to be made to make sure that Ukraine fully stands up on its feet.
What would be your main, or for instance, if we would say about single advice to your predecessor, to the person who come to do what you've been doing? What would be this thing he or she needs to know?
We have policies which we follow. Part of our role on the ground is to maintain a close policy dialogue, to be able to explain the policies that we would be able to support, to understand also the situation on the ground, and to be able to properly analyze the situation. So that is a constant in our work. I think it's in that work, and I think especially in Ukraine, I think it's important to be firm, but meaning to be firm on our principles and our policies, and especially on the structural changes that are needed to achieve sustainable growth in this country. I don't think it helps Ukraine if we are softening our principle or changing our principles. We need to find the best policies, and we need to provide our firm advice.